So, welcome to another episode of the UK AI podcast. And I'm delighted to be joined by James Hutt this morning from Paradigm Junction. So, James, it's great to have you here. Could you quickly introduce yourself and tell us about yourself?
Sure, thanks, Tim. Great to be here. So as you said, I set up a little company called Paradigm Junction a couple of years ago, and that was really at its core a way of letting me explore all of the changes that AI was causing for people's personal lives, people's business lives, the way that we organize things in society. And over the last couple of years, it's grown to be something that looks more like a consultancy. But the mission is the same, really, working with companies to work out how their world is changing, working out how their customer behavior changes, how their employee behavior changes because of these new tools that we're all playing with. And we help them respond to that change.
Amazing. Well, I've really enjoyed chatting to you offline before now, and I wanted to sort of bring some of those insights into this podcast so we can actually learn from some of your experiences as well. And I know that you work with a lot of businesses who are not traditionally technology companies. And I wonder whether you could share with us some of the things that you're seeing, how they're adopting and using AI tools.
Yeah, that's right. I think we've got used to it now with the internet, and we talked about internet companies and not internet companies probably 10, 15 years ago. And now we realize that every company's on the internet. And I think we feel pretty similarly about AI. Some of the other UKI members are AI first. They are businesses that think AI is what differentiates them from their competitors. But there are lots of businesses in the economy that have been around for decades that will be using AI, um, but that won't necessarily consider themselves AI businesses. And so they're the people we work with. And there's a real range of how people are adopting it. I think the thing we always find interesting when we go in to a new organization is to ask, well, who's running this? Who is running your adjustment to AI? And sometimes that's a CTO or a head of IT, and they're treating it very much as a new type of technology, and it's a technology question. Other times it might be the CEO or sometimes even the head of HR, the chief HR officer. Um, in those places, the response tends to be a bit more interesting because they've realized that this is a change to how we work, not just the tools that we have. And so if they start thinking about it as a change of strategy or a change of culture or a change of incentives, then they're tending to adopt quite a lot quicker than the companies that are treating this as a technology problem.
That's really interesting, and I think that is definitely the trend that we're seeing as well in the industry. That it's not just a technology problem, a technical issue. It's actually something across the entire UK. All businesses are trying to adopt AI, and it takes a different approach because it's not just about hiring people who understand AI. As you say, it's more about understanding how it fits into the organisation and how to drive that transformation and that mindset. But the interesting word you used there was incentives. I wanted to sort of find out a little bit more what you mean when you talk about incentives and how people can actually use incentives within the organization, where they're getting it right and wrong.
Yeah, so why don't I tell you a story? I won't tell you who it was that we worked with, but I'll tell you what we found when we went in. It's a pretty common picture. There were seniors who recognized how important AI could be to their business. They could quickly take what they were hearing about on podcasts like this or learning from playing with ChatGPT themselves and realize that that could make their teams way more efficient. But they also paid most of their frontline staff commission. They had a pretty low basic salary and very, very high variable pay on the basis of commission for the sales that they made. And so when they said, we want you to learn AI, we want you to work out how to change the way you work, they didn't give people time to do that, and they didn't change the commission targets that they needed to hit. What they did was put an extra requirement on the people on the front line. And then we did interviews with people across the range of this company, and the frontline staff said, well, if I take an afternoon off a week in order to learn how to use AI, I'm not going to get paid because I'm going to sell less in that period, and I'm being paid or sometimes even retained as an employee on the basis of hitting my sales targets. And so there was a real mismatch between the incentives that were actually being set by the business in hard terms, what matters is your sales number, and the words that they were saying, which were, we want you to invest some time in making that change. So the businesses that I think are getting it really right are finding ways to align those incentives. So sometimes that's really simple. It looks like celebrating people across the company who've played with some AI tools and found a way to make a productivity gain. Some of those are financial incentives, but more often than not, they're social or status ones. But finding some way to get people to think, yeah, if I step out of my day job for a few hours a week and instead invest in learning, in training others, in working out new ways of doing things, I'm going to get rewarded for that either in promotions or my end of year review. Then those are the places that you're finding, unsurprisingly, people are responding to those incentives. Just instructing people that this is a thing they need to do pretty rarely changes behavior there, I think.
That's really interesting to look at it from that holistic perspective. And some of the organizations where I've had to drive transformation in the past, it's been about using things like OKRs, where you actually start to look at how those different goals and objectives across the organizations align. And so rather than, I think, in some ways people would think about it as a hierarchy of setting an objective here and then making people ladder up. Actually, you use the word alignment, and that's exactly the right word. You're trying to sort of think about how you align all those different goals and objectives across the organization. But let me ask you, what's the role of the executives in this? Because I think you're working much more at this C-suite level. What role do they have in sort of bringing these incentives?
Yeah, so it's interesting you say OKRs. Those definitely do have a role. Having targets for people to hit is important. But I think the first thing executives need to do is check that they're not embedding the old way of doing things or embedding counter incentives into those OKRs. Because one of the areas we focus on a lot when we're talking to senior leaders is, well, are your middle managers really incentivized to make this change for you? Quite often, that's where the bottleneck comes. There's actually quite a lot of, at the staff level, tends to be a lot of enthusiasm, and at the top, there tends to be a lot of enthusiasm. But people in the middle tend to be pushed to be a bit more risk averse. They know if they miss their OKRs, if they miss targets based on how they've done things before because they've taken a risk, they've tried to make a change, then they'll suffer the downside. But if they're following what their seniors are doing and they're making changes to their ways of working, then perhaps they're not going to pick up the upside quite so much. So I think the first thing is to make sure that those reporting to you are clear that any counter incentives have been taken away. So that might be a quiet conversation. You tap someone on the shoulder and say, look, I know I'm asking you to do a lot of AI stuff at the moment, and that is really important for the long-term future. I want you to know that if that impacts your sales targets or if that impacts your customer service scores for the next 3 months, that's okay. We know we're investing something now and we're expecting a payback in the future. I think that the second thing they probably need to do is to create some slack. There's a really nice, I was going to say there's a really nice case study online. What I mean is I used deep research to write a really nice case study on what happened at the Passport Office recently. So for those people who don't nerd out about government technology quite as much as me, a few years ago, the Passport Office was on fire. The backlog stretched for months and months. Over 10,000 people wrote to their MPs to complain about how long it was taking to get a new passport. And they decided that something needed to be done. This was about 2021. And they did two things. First, they decided that they needed to radically change their processes to be more digital. I think a conversation that lots of businesses are having at the moment. And the second thing they did was hire massive surge support so that they had more than enough people to process the backlog and give the people there a bit of breathing room so they could make some change. I think if you think about your personal lives, it's really difficult to make positive changes when you're stressed up against it, running behind on everything, when you're picking up kids from school, rushing them to somewhere else. There just isn't the space to make a change. And it's the same for organizations, that you need to create a bit of slack. You need to create a bit of breathing room in the system for people to be able to make that change. And then probably the third thing, I realize this sounds like a long list, but it is only 3 things we think. The third thing is to make some real credible promises about what's going to happen when you free up people's time. There's an old saying, no one will learn a skill if their job depends on them not learning it. And I think that's very true in AI. There is a lot of fear that if you become much more efficient, then you'll need fewer workers. And that will lead to people being laid off. And that's a real cause of resistance in organizations. And so how do you make credible promises about what you're going to do if people become more productive? How will you retask them? What is the next thing you'd like to have time to do? How are they going to move up the value chain? That can give people confidence that really they should be finding these efficiencies and improving the way they work, and it's not immediately going to benefit the company at their own expense. So remove counter incentives, create some slack, make some credible promises about what you'll do. I think you won't go too wrong with that.
Interesting. Yeah, I'd love to hear a bit more about the counter incentives that you mentioned. But I think that there's also something around innovations and how to bring that innovative thinking into an organization that I'd love to get your sort of thoughts on. Yesterday, actually, I was at an event and there was someone from the government CDDO who was talking about during COVID how they had a lot of it just forced a lot of radical thinking because they had to cope with all sorts of changes, right? In the way that people were working from home, the particular challenges of all the data, of all the technology, of trying to find solutions. So they were just, it was a crisis basically, but it forced new innovative thinking across all different levels of the organization. And then interestingly, they said, but after COVID, then it kind of went back to almost like business as usual, and there was that sort of inertia there. So I wonder whether that's the type of thing you mean when you talk about counter incentives.
Yeah, that exactly the sort of thing I mean. And I was also thinking of government. So I don't know if we've talked about this before. I worked on one of the data science teams in government during the pandemic. And it was fascinating. I'd come in from the outside just to help with the COVID response, but I was working alongside people who'd been data scientists in government doing really good work for years and years. And they said, James, you don't understand how strange this is. I email a department and say, I need some data, and they send it back that afternoon. I said, well, what normally happens? They said, oh, normally if you email them, say, I need some data, then they ask for your lawyer's phone number. You get two lawyers involved and you set up a data sharing agreement between the two departments that covers off the risk of anything going wrong.
Wow.
And so that broke down. And I think it really is here about risk and incentives. It's about having cover to make a decision that probably is the right one in the face of, knowledge that if you get it wrong, then there might be bigger fires out there. And in the pandemic, it probably wouldn't be terminal because you were trying to do the right thing, you were moving fast and things get broken. I think what we've seen as that crisis period has eased up is a return back to call it the precautionary principle that, well, if I share this with you, or if we do something new and it goes wrong, I'm absolutely going to be told off. I'm absolutely going to wear professional risk for doing the thing differently, rather than the sort of continued belief that there is this mission that we're driving towards. And so it becomes easier and easier to go back to the sort of let's lawyer up, or let's make sure we're following the process and some guardrails. You see this in the private sector. The UK government's actually been pretty good at testing out some of the AI tools. There've been pilots, particularly with Copilot, where they have worked very closely with Microsoft to have a safe setup so that employees can use tools internally and know that the data is not going to leak. Lots of private sector companies, particularly the smaller ones, haven't got the clout to do that, to negotiate specific data safety agreements with Microsoft. And so they've just banned the use of tools. And that, I think, is really harmful. Where we see the policies being you're banned from using it, what that tends to lead to is people using it on their personal devices because they're recognizing quite how important this is for them. And so they are exposing companies to just as much risk, but the companies then aren't getting the benefit of the learning. They aren't getting people talking about what they're doing and having that shared around. And so that's sort of who's wearing the risk, and does an employee know where the boundaries are and able to take a bit of risk within that, is an important way for setting it up so that people can experiment, but experiment safely.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much that we could unpack there about how businesses are actually engaging with the tools which they want to use, and a number of issues around things like security and privacy, and actually just how companies are able to kind of use their own data sets to enhance the tools which are openly available. But I'm conscious that actually, we haven't really talked about technology very much in this conversation, which is kind of surprising, given that that's ultimately what these companies are using in this sort of transformation. Is that because the technology is almost commoditized, do you think? Or is it because the challenges here aren't about technology, they're about bringing the humans along and getting humans on board?
So it's a great question. The technology is changing really fast, and there are real differences between the technology that you use. I think what they're not is legible enough that you can have someone centrally who is a tech expert making those decisions for you. We both work in the area, and it's, I think you'll agree, pretty hard keeping up with what model is the best and what tool is the best for transcribing meetings, and if I pay my £20 a month to OpenAI, what features does that include? So the technology is definitely still changing, but that I don't think means the approach is to have a technology leader leading the change. And I think that's because there are some constant features, regardless of exactly which chatbot you use or exactly which transcription tool you use. There are some common features that look much more like human factors. So there's a really nice analogy. Someone called Ethan Mollick, who, if you're not following the area, I would really recommend following his Substack called One Useful Thing. He says painting isn't restricted to chemists, but paints are absolutely made of chemicals.
Mm.
But painting itself is much more of an art. And he's saying that to say, well, AI tools are digital. They are made with computers and they run on computers, but that doesn't mean that using them is a technical art. They are, more than any computer technology we've seen before, about language. And the people who are able to get the best results out of them also tend to be people who are really good managers. They're able to give context, they're able to give a vision, they're able to set direction for someone doing a task, and they're able to say what the good outcome of that task is going to look like you might with a junior employee. So I think the reason it's not about tech leaders for me is because using these tools and getting the best out of them is much more about managing something that is a bit like a person to get the results you want than it is about deciding which software you want to buy and what SaaS license agreement you should set up.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think that is the way in which the technology is changing now. As we start to go into what people are already calling the year of agentic AI, it's going to be a lot easier for everyone to just talk to an agent and get it to do what they needed to do without having to have any technical language or skills. And I think the other part of this is that across all organizations, both as consumers and as employees, there needs to be a level of basic AI literacy. And that doesn't mean being able to code or program. It just means being really having the confidence and to have tried a few things and made a few mistakes, understand that's okay, and then feel confident enough to make the next stage. For me, the characteristic which is most important here is curiosity and humility. And I think that needs to be encouraged both within the organizations, also within schools, just this concept that actually the only way you can learn is by making mistakes. That's how very young children learn, but somehow through the educational process, by the time kids get to teenage years, they're less willing to make mistakes. They're more risk averse, and that's something which I think we need to change. And I think we started to see that a little bit with the digital transformation. We've been doing that now for 10, 15 years, and that's part of the mindset change there. But it's now even more important than ever because, as you've highlighted, the technologies will come and go. They'll keep on coming. And I think in one of the roundtables, I quoted you as saying that we're going to be constantly having to adapt for the next transformation if we're thinking of them as events. But if we actually change the mindset, then we'll always be able to cope with each transformation. So I wanted to get your advice for if there's a CEO or a C-suite person who's listening to this, what do you think are the most important things that they should be focused on?
So I would wholeheartedly back what you've said about curiosity. We ask people to experiment. I think there's some good academic literature that says 10 hours playing with one of these tools is about the point at which you start to have an intuitive sense of what might or might not be possible. I know that sounds like quite a lot, but I guess I'd flip the question and say, if you're a leader in an organization and you think this is important, but you can't find 10 hours to play with it yourself, then what signal is that sending to the rest of your organization about quite how important it is? We did some work with one of the leaders of the Chartered Institute for IT, and they had a really nice point that said, you can't get to be a CEO of a large organization without understanding how finance works. You don't need to have been a CFO, but you do need to know what a balance sheet is. And we've because the technology changes so fast, it changes much quicker than people become senior in organizations. We accept that senior leaders are able to say, well, I don't quite understand technology, and so I pass that on to someone else. So I think I'd say be curious about how your organization works on a technology basis. Be curious about what you can do with the tools, because that will send a real signal to everyone you work with that it's valuable. And then there's a question of, well, how do you stay in touch? Because there is so much happening and so much coming out that you really need to choose your key sources of information, because even following this full time, it's impossible to follow every latest model release or have an opinion on whether Claude is better than ChatGPT. I don't think that is where you should be focusing as a leader. I think you should be asking yourself, we decided to do a newsletter approximately monthly because if something doesn't matter a month later, then it probably wasn't worth paying attention to in the first place. Find a, a, a manageable speed of information, find ways to bring that into your regular work. So that might be working groups that bring together people from the front line of your business with the senior leaders so you can talk to them directly about how they're using these tools. That might be reading a newsletter. I mentioned Ethan Mollick's, I've mentioned ours. That digests the information for you. That might be finding one supplier that you really trust and putting your eggs in one basket and having a partnership with them. There'll be a few different approaches, but I think setting up the information flows so that you're able to spend a little bit of time but get some high quality information about how this is changing the way that your organization works is probably the big strategic change. And then, yeah, as you said, be curious, experiment, have a play, and don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Brilliant. I think the industry as a whole is maturing. It's past, and I say the industry, the AI industry, kind of companies who are engaging and trying to transform their organizations and their workforces. There's a lot which needs to be built here. We've talked a lot about the guardrails, we've talked a bit about the mindset, empowering curiosity. That is the role of the leaders, isn't it? To be able to then sort of actually sort of take a lead and figure this out. There really isn't much of a playbook. You've got a lot of insight here, so people could come and talk to you about this. But I think a lot of I'm still here from some people in organisations who they're not convinced. And one of the things I heard actually was from quite a big law firm the other day, where they were saying that some of the partners there, they're in their 50s, they're going to be retiring soon, and they're sort of like saying, well, we're not leaning into this. We'll let somebody else sort of sort it out. So it's a sort of almost internal sabotage. I think maybe at the other end of the company, also some junior people are sort of saying, well, I can't be. I'm not bothered to get involved with this now. I can't see the point of it. So there is sort of sabotage. There is sort of lack of engagement at some parts of the organisation. Does this come back to incentives, or what would you say to some of those people who think they can just avoid this and it doesn't matter to them?
Yeah, we're really getting into sort of big questions of corporate governance and who controls a firm, and is it the people who are at the top right now, or is it the people who are going to be at the top in a decade's time? Um, Obviously, for the biggest public companies, shareholders have a big role in making sure that the executives today aren't coasting into retirement, not paying attention to something that's got the potential to really disrupt things down the line. Law firms tend to work on a partnership model, so it's a bit trickier to say to them. I think maybe I'd point out that there's two ways that organizations tend to change. They either change from within, and there are quite a lot of car companies that have managed to shift how they manufacture and switch to a much more efficient manufacturing process. And then also looking at the car industry, there's companies that don't change and that disappear from view, and they get competed from outside. And so look at the market capitalization of Tesla versus all of the other automakers combined. They found new ways of doing things. So I think I'd say to you, if you think this perhaps isn't going to affect you, well, one, what do you want the legacy to be? If this change plays out over the next 5 or 10 years, do you want to be the executives that missed the shift and didn't do anything to prepare? And secondly, I'd say look out for if really top talent starts moving. I think increasingly AI firms are trying to find ways to make money that isn't providing big general tools. And so there are announcements about partnerships with government or partnerships with accountancy firms or law specific tools, or LinkedIn have released the recruitment assistant. Technology companies are using their tools to compete in specific industry verticals, but they know they've learned some of the lessons of the last 10 years. You can't come to a market with no knowledge about how it works. And so they're increasingly looking to hire really top talent from law and from recruitment and from accountancy and bring them into the tech company and say, well, work with us and we'll make something that can outcompete your old firm. So if you're not convinced, I'd say that would be a warning signal to start looking for. And I guess history will tell how this plays out. Some companies will survive because they'll lobby effectively, and the law will prevent them from being competed with by other people. You might think about the medical sector, where there are really strict laws governing who can give medical advice that aren't always connected to the you can't test an AI model and prove that it's capable of being a doctor. So there will be areas that hold out. But if you're not in a regulated industry, then I think have a look around and see who's moving where.
Absolutely. And I think what I'm taking away from that is disrupt yourself before someone else disrupts you, right? Because actually, that's the challenge that we all face as we're sort of trying to build our companies. We're looking inward a lot of the time, but we have to be looking at the horizon, seeing what those competitors are doing. And sometimes they're over the horizon. And unless we're sort of thinking in that way, we're not going to be able to kind of have the incentives to use the word that I think you've used as a thread throughout this conversation. We need to find that incentive to then affect that change. James, it's been fantastic. We could talk for hours about all these topics. I'd love to get you back again in the future, maybe on some webinars as well, but it's been great to have you here. Thank you so much for spending some time with us on the podcast today.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it. And yeah, always enjoy our conversations. So happy to spend some time here this morning.